Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is a lecture for History 156, American Sexualities. And for the next few lectures, I'm going to be giving a history of gay and lesbian life in the United States in the 20th century. The first lecture, though, is going to be entitled Male Homosexual Behavior Before World War II. And the reason I'm not just saying gays and lesbians is that the idea of the gay person and the lesbian person developed over the 20th century. Really, at the beginning of the 20th century, we don't have any idea of what gays and lesbians. We don't have any idea of what the concept meant because to the best of our knowledge, they didn't have the idea that there was a kind of man who had preferred to have sex with other men, and there was a kind of woman who preferred to have sex with other women. Mostly what we know about is not feelings, but behaviors. And one of the reasons we only know about behaviors is that a lot of what we know has to do with police records, people being arrested for doing things. So we know more about the things that they did than we know about the kind of people they were. There's also another interesting note on this sign, which is that first I'm going to talk about male homosexual behavior in the working class. And then down here I have and slumming, because sometimes people from the middle class who liked the kind of sex that working class people were having would go to working class neighborhoods where they did not usually hang out, and certainly where they did not live. And then later on I'm going to be talking about the middle class as a separate phenomenon. We were talking about the 19th century and about the fact that although people felt romantic love for each other and wrote about it in letters, the idea of having sex with a person of the same gender was a separate idea. And today we think of this as very strange. We think, if you're in love with somebody, you go to bed with them. But that wasn't, and in fact, it isn't necessarily always the case right now. There are people who love each other who, for one reason or another, medical reasons or whatever, are unable to have sex. But in the 19th century, the idea that two people would have sex together was not an idea that had to do with emotions and desires that drew them to do it. The idea was that if two people had sex together, it was a sin, and that it was something that they were doing out of their sinfulness and not because they had natural desires that needed to be fulfilled. And we see this to a certain extent playing out in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, but we also know more about what was going on in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, primarily in the big cities. Of course, one reason we don't know much about gay life in the United States in the big cities before the Civil War is that there weren't really very many big cities in the United States before the Civil War. But lately, we have been doing a lot more research. In fact, one of the people, George Chauncey, who has written a book called Gay New York, from which a lot of the material I'm going to be talking about today was taken, was in my class at Yale, the class in 1977. So this is all fairly recent stuff, at least in my lifetime. We talked about the idea that as we move from a period in history when most people are living on farms and most people are living in a family unit, to a period after the Industrial Revolution where there are many more people living in cities and there are more people living in environments where their socializing is not done within a family context, because very often people are living 5 or 6 or 7 people to a room, and in order to socialize, they have to go outside the house. They're not going to be socializing inside the house. And one of the things you see working class people doing, we've talked about this, is going to what are sometimes called concert saloons or dance halls, which were places where there would be entertainment up on a stage, but there would also be drinks served in the audience, and people would be engaging in social interaction in the way that they don't usually anymore in a theater or in a concert hall. And we know, because there are newspaper reports about it, that in the 1890s, it may have been happening earlier, we don't know, In the 1890s, there were concert saloons and dance halls in the Bowery that specialized in a particular kind of clientele. The people who went to these particular dance halls were men who wanted to have sex with female identified men. And I'll explain this a little bit more in a minute. And also, of course, the female identified men would go there. And some of the female identified men were prostitutes and were doing it for money, and presumably some of them were just doing it because that's what they wanted. Now, in the working class, and this is one of the things that historians have been investigating for a while, in the working class, gendered relationships were based on behavior. In other words, you were considered to be a woman if you behaved like a woman, and you were considered to be a man if you behaved like a man. And your physical equipment was not as important as your social behavior. So you had in these dance halls that catered to this particular kind of interaction, you had men who behaved like real men and dressed like real men, and also men who did not behave like women in such a way that you could have mistaken them for women, but they were men who behaved in an effeminate way and who had particular kinds of things about the way they presented themselves. You know, they had hair that was a little bit more sleekly done than a man would do, or you know, they would be wearing clothes that were not the colors of they would be wearing things like pink shirts. You know, times change. But so you have these places where people interact, but they interact in a very gendered way. It's just not a gendered way that is determined by your biological gender and your biological equipment. And the interesting thing is that the men who go to these places and are dressed as men and behave like men are not considered to have anything weird about them. They like to go to bed with these people who are described as fairies. That was the term that they used back in those days. I realize that that's a pejorative term today that gay people don't want to have applied to them. But men who dressed in an effeminate way and behaved in an effeminate way were thought of as fairies, and real men, quote unquote, who liked to go to bed with fairies were not considered to be abnormal. It was just considered that that's one of the things that guys do, or can do. Some guys didn't like to do it, and other guys did like to do it, but it was among the working class, as long as you behaved like a man, and as long as you went to bed with somebody who behaved like a woman, you were still maintaining this gender complementarity. Now, you might say, I mean, you think of working class guys as being these big macho guys who, you know, are not at all interested in gay people. And as I say, there were people in the working class who didn't do this, but there were specific circumstances in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century among the working class that might have promoted the idea that this would be an acceptable alternative for men to adopt. For one thing, a lot of the working class men in New York City in the 1890s were single men. There were certain ethnicities where people tended to move to the United States as a family. For instance, Jews who were moving to the United States in the 1890s and the early 20th century tended to bring their whole family along with them. Italian men, on the other hand, very often came to the United States to work here for a few years and make a lot of money, which they would then take home to Italy, where their wife and children were waiting for them. And while they were here in the United States, they didn't think of themselves as being committed to a relationship with a woman who was biologically a woman. The idea of many Italian men who were on their own was that the person you had sex with, the partner you had sex with, was, you know, anybody who could give you a good time. One of the things that is still, I think, characteristic of Italian Americans today is that they tend to congregating groups of men. One of the things that you often see, or used to see, in cities were these Italian American social clubs, which would be all men. So Italian society, the Italian social world for working class men, was a very male-oriented society. We are all men together. And if you had sex with somebody who identified in female ways, that would not be having sex with another one. That would not be having sex with a male buddy. That would be having sex with somebody outside your male circle. And as long as the person that you were having sex with didn't claim to be a male, didn't claim to be a male like you were, a real male who hung out with other real males, then it was all right for you to have sex with that person. Of course, you didn't necessarily have to respect the person that you were having sex with. And of course, a lot of working class macho men don't really respect women in general. The working class men sometimes, visited domestic violence on their wives, and they would similarly go out and beat up these so-called fairies in order to prove that they were different, in order to prove that they were men and that the people they were beating up were not men. There are other reasons that people might want to make, not exactly so much make an excuse, but not pay attention to the distinctions that would otherwise be made. You had people who had careers like sailors, for instance, who had no particular home life. They didn't have a place where they lived. And so when they came into New York City, they were not looking to find somebody with whom they could get married and settle down and have children. And if it was just sex, then for many of these guys, it didn't really matter whether it was a biological man or a biological woman, as long as they were playing the male part and the woman was playing the female part. Another group of people that you see this happening with is hobos, migrants, people who would, ride the rails. This was true a lot more before World War I, before 1920, say, than it was afterwards, because before 1920, you needed transient help. And in other words, for instance, if you were running a farm, you didn't necessarily need a whole bunch of people to help you on a yearly basis, but you might need extra help for guys to come in and help you bring in the harvest. And there were men who enjoyed the life of traveling around doing this kind of sporadic work that, paid you a few months a year, and then just traveling around to see where the next job was going to be. And these were guys who were much more interested in establishing this kind of gendered behavior relationship. The man who behaved like a man and the usually a younger man who behaved in an effeminate way and behaved towards the older man in a way that a wife would behave towards a husband. The young man would take care of the older man, cook meals for him, and things like that. And for these people, it wouldn't matter that the person who was playing the wife, in fact, sometimes these hobos referred to their partners as their wives, it wouldn't matter that the person who was playing the wife was not, quote, really a woman, because the younger partner was behaving in all the ways that a woman would behave, and that was what made it okay. You might ask the question, well, what if you ran into a guy for whom it's not just a matter of complete indifference whether he's having sex with a man or having sex with a woman? As I said, there were some people who were not interested in having sex with an effeminate man, and there were also men who seemed to prefer it. They would rather have sought out an effeminate man to have sex with than have sex with a woman. I mean, there's a lot of these people of both genders were prostitutes, and if a guy wanted a female prostitute, he would have no trouble finding a female prostitute. But some of these men hired male prostitutes who were effeminate and presented themselves as fairies. And apparently that was okay. Apparently you wouldn't necessarily advertise it, but there are social workers who were interviewing lower class Italian or working class Italian men who were saying to them, I live with this fairy and we have a great sex life and they would they would be acting as if there was nothing wrong with it. And apparently, to them, there was nothing wrong. This is a very different idea from the idea that we have today. But it is also, by the way, an idea that you see very often in Latin American communities and in Hispanic communities. When you have gay men what we would consider two gay men living together, very often in Latino culture, one of the men is very masculine oriented, behaves very much like a heterosexual male, and may even consider himself to be a heterosexual male. And he is in a partnership with another man, often younger, who is much more effeminate, much more like a wife, might be staying home and, doing the dishes and doing the laundry and cooking the meals, while the man is off earning a living and supporting the family. So this is not something that is, it doesn't really happen so much anymore, I think, because attitudes towards being gay have changed. But it's something that used to be much more common and is still in many cultures considered to be a normal thing for a presumably normal man to do, to choose, instead of having a woman to have as a sexual partner, to have an effeminate man as a sexual partner. Let's stop here and begin again.